En route to the Time and Temporality conference, and looking for the venue, one of two buildings comprising the faculty club, we encountered a participant of a simultaneous space conference who knew of no pedestrian shortcut, though he could confirm the longer automobile route. We arrived late, 16 September 2013. The idea of a space conference being held simultaneously at the same university as a time and temporality conference, and the two not coming together, is, to me, quite extraordinary. This begins with an epigraph, Walter Benjamin. Instead of asking, what is the attitude of a work to the relations of production of its time? Does it accept them? Is it reactionary? Or does it aim at overthrowing them? Is it revolutionary? Instead of this question, or at any rate before it, I should like to propose another. Rather than ask, what is the attitude of a work to the relations of production of its time? I should like to ask, what is the position in them? This question directly concerns the function the work has within the literary relations of production of its time. It is concerned, in other words, directly with the literary technique of works. This paper juxtaposes the poetry of Nancy Cunard and Richard Aldington so as to explore their interruptive engagements with temporality. Nancy Cunard's 1925 Parallax is an extended self and critical analysis responding to the legacy of World War I, in which her lover, Peter Broughton Adderley, was killed 1 month before the armistice. The shifts in time throughout the poem evoke a focus that may be perceived differently from another time or place, but whose subject is steadfast in being lost. Richard Aldington's A Fool of the Forest, A Phatasmagoria, was also published in 1925, and its forms and meters are temporally numerous. Both of these poems have been compared to T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, though each is its own particular combination of temporal textures and post-war crises. I propose that time in Cunard's Parallax is experienced pneumatically, as in a heart valve's opening and closing, the poem's temporality flowing, but not unidirectionally. Emotional registers emerge to then shift and race in other stanzas and locations of the poem's speaking subject: London, France, Italy. It can be argued that the temporality of the text is akin to a heart murmur, that condition when not all the blood is pushed through the valve. Some of it washes back, as do the thoughts of the speaking subject in Cunard's poem. In A Fool of the Forest, Aldington's prefatory note makes clear that the three characters are one person split into three. The I, a then contemporary man, more fitted for an art than a scientific civilization, is at a moment of crisis. Les Éteints, from the Commedia dell'arte, represents the imaginative faculties. The conjurer symbolizes intellectual faculties: age, science, authority. Although the reader's experience of the text is closer to dream time, illogical and changing abruptly, the temporal shifts resemble the quotidian and gesturally marked time of an hourglass being turned one way only to be interrupted, turned by another before running its course, the sudden directional changes indicating the three characters' competing arguments in uneven ebbs and flows. Both works consider temporality in unstable, multi-directional ways. To read these two works, published in 1925, is to further understand the destabilizing aftermath of World War I on English poets' conceptions of time. While acknowledging Eliot's 1922 forerunner, The Waste Land, these texts offer alternative syncopatory temporalities of their own. In his autobiography, Life for Life's Sake, published in 1941, there is an account of Aldington's oddly prophetic conversation with Eliot while visiting Padworth Cemetery. Surprised that Eliot admired something so popular as Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, Aldington went on to say that if a contemporary poet, conscious of his limitations, as Gray evidently was, would concentrate all his gifts on one such poem, might he achieve similar success? He writes that he didn't know that Eliot was already contemplating, perhaps had even begun writing, The Wasteland, but upon having the manuscript read to him by Eliot in London a year or so later, he was profoundly affected. A Fool of the Forest, a Phatasmagoria, is divided into 34 parts. The three characters in one speaking subject allow for a range of styles, languages, epochs, and registers of time and place. In part 4, The Voyage of Telemachus, the conjurer tells of how the elderly Telemachus seeks to meet the ghost of his father, Odysseus, to learn the state of the dead, if at last the soul be at peace. And the actions he so hopefully takes up, building a ship and sailing with 100 men, frères, past the Isle of Calypso and past the land of the Lotus. In night, under night, they traversed the death-dark ocean until a shore was struck. 3 altars are built, ditches dug about them, that the hungry ghosts might drink the speech-giving blood of the bulls. And 3 times the length of a day, they lived in that mortal darkness. 3 times the victims were sacrificed, and 3 times Telemachus cried the name of his father Odysseus. Yet in this space of darkness, which had begun with the old Telemachus drooling by the fire in the evening, there is no flicker of any kind of illumination. In that suspended darkness, the living Telemachus waits in vain for the ghosts to arrive to answer his unanswerable question. And so there came no sight and no sound, only infinite darkness and silence. There is no direct mention of A Fool in the Forest in Aldington's memoirs, simply a reference to the fact he was writing a long poem while simultaneously working too hard on other projects. Nor is it included in the titles of books by Richard Aldington in Life for Life's Sake. It is temporarily excised and left to share space with others in his collected poems, omitting therein the final 2 sentences of the prefatory note in the first edition. Several quotations are woven into the piece. The 2 longest are from Aristophanes and Anatole France. Throughout the poem, Aldington's love of the classics is palpable. Already in part 3, the tripartite speaking subject set sail for Athens, and part 4 opens on the Acropolis, and before the conjurer relates the Telemachus account, he has been quoting variously Morat and Tennyson and heaven knows whom besides. Part 8 sees much trade of wine, and Mezzotint, the fool, sings scraps of foolish verse, to the increasing consternation of the conjurer. Quoting, "Now the conjurer is something of a prig. He reads too many books and writes for reputable journals. He hopes that someday the Academy, the British one, will make his name immortal. He got quite angry, and his face glowed like a parboiled meteor in the gloom. He shouted, 'You are a lunatic, shut up.'" Unquote. As this fails to silence Mezzotint, he is cut short by the conjurer's assessment that he's a drunken fool, but the eye retorts, "Let Mezzotint alone, he's my fool, and he's not a bore like you. At any rate, his stuff's original, not watered down William Morris, dashed with Swinburne, like all your drivel about Telemachus." The wine was finished in silence. Cunard and Aldington are both writers acutely and self-consciously sensitive to space-time. Perhaps hypertemporal would be one way to describe these 2 poems. Could we slide back and forth through space and time? Asks Aldington's speaking subject. Is it the end or beginning? Caesura, not in the time thread, queries Cunard's own. In each case, the extreme displacements and trauma resulting from their respective experiences of World War I, in Aldington's case this included the trenches, were in a phase of being worked through. Aldington was not to fully achieve this until he wrote his novel, Death of a Hero, which he began in 1928, which may be the reason for not including the poem in his list of works, another temporally related decision. Yet there is insight and powerfully prescient writing in A Fool of the Forest. But I've a plan to thwart the stars. We'll form a company, we'll buy the sky and let it out for advertising. Large bills by day, electric signs at night. We'll make a fortune, and no one then will have a chance to think, because we'll all have houses made of glass, the new epiphany. And that made me think of hell. It was like a crematorium, or rather a cadaver factory, where every day millions of persons were consumed to smoke. Out of 10,000 towering chimneys gushed black, greasy smoke that whitened to a cloud of banknotes. In terms of how Aldington and Cunard's respective poems position themselves within their own time, both follow in the wake of Eliot's Wasteland and mark an interrupted and interruptive to and fro temporally, psychologically, and emotionally. Aldington is nostalgic for the circumstances that once allowed science and the arts a coexistence of harmony, and for him that is the historical period of classical Greece. Yes, this Parthenon is harmony, science and beauty reconciled with health. We have beauty that's diseased and wanton, art that plays with ugliness and fantasy, science heavy, technical and mystic, stupid health for some, the rest imperfect. There is cynicism and bitterness to his satire, so the swings into past and fast forward to future, the cadaver factory, for example, which I earlier suggested as gesturally marking time by upending an hourglass before it has run its course, temper the eruptive bitterness. Cunard makes her poet fool tread all roads that circle back, and know the mirage in the desert's eyes, the desert voices wait, this clouded fool who must halt in every tavern. In the penumbra of the wilderness, on the rim of the Dye along Commercial Street, you meet one like you for an hour or two, but eventual sameness creeps to repossess, all eyes supplicant, offering unusable fidelities, eyes of defiance sulking into assent, acute with repetition, aged by a stale demand. Though I did mark the turn of every hand, in the beginning, tendered my respect to anterooms, while the sand ran from the hours. Cunard presents London as a site of youth and heartbreak, growing from the ashes, the jail of what I am, and poses a poignant question made possible by the parallax at work. Are the living ghosts to the dead, or do the dead disclaim this clutch of hands, the tears cast out to them? Must one be courteous, have defunct regrets, present oneself as host to yesteryear? Cunard's poet hero does not yearn for a past as distant as that of classical Greece. Her reference to both Cézanne and another whose old life slips out, patriarch of 11 inhabitants, include an appreciation for more recent periods before the war than Aldington's tripartite-speaking subject. Yet the patriarch is fatigué, she said, a terse beldame by the latch. Il est fatigué depuis 12 ans, toujours dans le même coin. He's tired, after 12 years still in the same corner. Evokes a vastly different temporal sense than that of the poet heroes. And Cézanne is remembered by an old waiter crossly. Of course I knew him. He was a dull, silent fellow, dead now. Each temporal sense will eventually share that inevitable fate. The poet hero asserts, with wine alone one is allowed to think, less cumbrously, and if one may recall little, there's always tomorrow, when a something sore gropes in the brain, And shall one not condone the shame, the doubt of this, the automaton, with no particular headache, with only subsiding chords, echoes of transience? There seems a point when Aldington's always interrupted hourglass meets Cunard's heart murmur moments in her lines, "O commemorable fusion of science with disease." That was a new contemplation, the Death Museum. There is frustration expressed by the poet hero about the words clouding, spoiling, getting between one and the mark, and oh, the hypocrisy of the surrender in the written word. He answers his own question of what can be remembered that was seen long ago, always long ago, variously, concluding, "One for another I have changed my prisons, held fast as the flame stands, locked in the prison." The poet hero sees at one end a mirage of old beauty and patches of associations, at one side crossroads, and behind him nights and cities, rising on the inexpressible meaning of their streets. Only the dawn comes to his today, the resumed love songs and the rhythms of illusion, where around him legend of other times on dry gold background, and finally, before him, the articulate skeleton, shadow, who has walked with recording eyes a rich, bitter world. The heart close with the brain crossed by the heart. Cunard's poet hero ends the poem with a reference to hands, impotent through time that lift and fall, along a question, nor of passing and repassing, by the twin affirmations of never and forever, in doubt, in shame, in silence. Time, in a sense, as murmured between never and forever, pulsing back and forth. For Aldington, it is the firing of the conjurer's revolver in a World War I sequence in part 26, and the eye knowing that Mezzotint must be dead, that makes that moment something vital left me forever. However, this is not the temporal conclusion, as that would be logical, and life flows on and on and on. There is a return to London where the speaking eye is full of melancholy, now that Mezzotint is dead. Parties are gone to where some think he looks well, others miserable. Even the British Museum's reading room numbed him. It is as if the temporal hourglass, formerly swung violently to and fro to interrupt its course, has split in two, with time flowing without pause from the two remaining characters, with Mezzotint's demise. Yet it is only after the conjurer's frightful gaffe, by saying something about a soldier's hardships to a wealthy tradesman, that the speaking eye feels there is something he ought to do. By walking the London streets, he considers his course, but rejects political assassination, anarchist attacks, and Bolshevism. Some inbred skepticism destroyed all my plans. So he and the conjurer continue their nocturnal walks, the conjurer discoursing intently. The eye notes that time glides over but does not touch. Time is patient. At about 3 a.m. one morning, stopping by Waterloo Bridge, the conjurer ends his discourse with his favorite piece of cant, "We'll make a man of you, my son, now that Mezzotint is dead." The speaking eye can't bear this, and exasperation lending him wits, he seizes the conjurer firmly by the ankles and sends him headlong into the river. They never found his body. Returns to his room to sleep a heavy sleep. In the penultimate part 33, the eye is now a loyal English husband with children who works at an office. "Everything I do is wise and orderly. My will is made, my life's insured. The house is being slowly purchased. Yesterday I bought a family grave." Still, pangs are experienced which haunt and wound and tear the heart to the point of anguish. Need I fall so low as this? Need I prison up my spirit in so meek and regular a cage? Throughout human history, events resulting in mass death, be they due to war, contagious diseases, famine, or natural catastrophes, have severely impacted survivors. For these two writers and other post-World War I artists, the relation of time within their art forms and their emotional and intellectual lives was altered by their experiences individually and collectively as a generation. An engagement with temporality in these newly sensitive perspectives figured prominently in these two poems, exploring this fraught, hypertemporal process and the effect on the writers themselves. Thank you.
Thank you.